Hey everyone, how you doing? Hermes here. Today I'd like to go over a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Wilhelm Reich. A name not a lot of people are familiar with, but from here on out you're probably going to hear me babbling about him very often. So for those of you not terribly familiar, psychoanalysis all started with the Papa Bear himself, Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud was the pioneer of such concepts as the ego, the id, the unconscious, all of these ideas that became mainstream language in the Western world once he started studying the old Greek classics. Now technically Freud had many students, but I'm just going to talk about two today, that being Carl Jung and Wilhelm Reich, two of the more famous of his pupils. So between these three gentlemen, between Jung, Reich, and Freud, there's a very interesting dynamic I want to make note of, and it's a kind of Holy Trinity of psychoanalysis, the three pillars of where the thinking was going at the time, with Freud being at the top as the authoritarian aspect, Carl Jung being the mystical or religious aspect of psychology, trying to pierce the unconscious, and then there's Wilhelm Reich, who stands as a kind of outlier, who is trying to synthesize psychology in terms of the biological core of primates and how they interact in a workplace, for instance. Now, each of these men had their own conclusions about the course of humanity and what to do with the destruction that was fomenting at the time after the First and Second World Wars. And Freud's conclusion, which he made pretty clear in Civilization and Its Discontents, was that humanity had an aggressive instinct towards self-destruction and it needed to be subjugated or in some way ruled over in order to prevent this from causing a global catastrophe.
Don't worry about it, man. Right?
Don't touch me, motherfucker. Get out.
Sigmund Freud said as much in the very last page of Civilization and Its Discontents, and I quote, "The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction." Now, Carl Jung takes a little bit of a different approach to this problem, and his solution is hinted at in one of his major essays, I believe his last essay, The Undiscovered Self. The West has unfortunately not yet woken up to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues, delivered with so much enthusiasm, is mere bombination in the void. It is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. We are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational or moral arguments, but with an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times, and these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflection, and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmac, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. So obviously here you can see a clear distinction taking place between Jung, the student, and Freud, the father figure. Freud believed that suppression was necessary to maintain society, and Jung believed that something more of a kind of super faith was necessary, a new mysticism to cohere humanity. Where Reich differs in this is where you really begin to see the contrast in these thinkers. From Ether, God, and Devil. The human animal can learn to understand and love nature inside and outside himself only if he thinks and acts the way nature functions, namely, functionally, and not mechanistically or mystically. In order to break through the vicious circle in which man finds himself entangled, it is necessary to understand and acknowledge the rational and useful, as well as the useless in the irrational within, and only within, the given framework of living and thinking. Without such an understanding, every attempt to improve the human lot is bound to fail and to end in worse conditions than those it was to abolish. The common denominator of all these cruel failures is man himself, who cut himself loose from his own nature. Whatever he takes over is bound to perish as long as he does not finally attack his own biophysical structure. And this is no longer a question of politics, but of the disarmoring of the human animal, of how our newborn babies grow up. And at the end of Ether, God, and Devil, Reich asks a very important question. If the devil represents distorted nature, and God is primal, true nature, why does man feel so much more drawn to the devil than to God? Why the great, eternally frustrating effort to redeem man from sin, i.e., from the temptation of the devil? If the beauty, harmony, and life-enhancing power of God is so obvious and so convincingly postulated? The answer is, again, the devil is tempting and so easy to follow because it represents the secondary drives that are so accessible to people. God is boring and distant because he represents the core of life that has been made inaccessible by human character armoring. So there you have it, 3 very different and yet somehow complementary views of psychoanalysis. All born out of Freud's libido theory, all tethered to that theory of sexual repression and the economics of neurosis. But they all took different approaches, and ultimately Freud and Jung and Reich all diverged from one another. Jung was kind of the distant child, and Reich carved his own path, eventually being ostracized himself. But that's a story for another video. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.